Hey everybody, thanks for joining White Dog Outdoors and volume 3 of our Nymphing for Steelhead series. I think today's video is probably going to be the best in the series. Today, we're going to talk about the different types of water that we fish and how we target Nymphing for steelhead in those different types of water, plus the different types of conditions and the times of year that we're going to deal with and what we expect those fish to be doing and how we're going to target those streams to be able to be successful during those times. So I think today's going to be a great video. I hope you guys will subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you know when the rest of our series is coming. But let's get into today's video. All right, so let's talk about the different size waters that we're potentially going to fish. I'm going to work myself from the larger streams, the larger rivers, down to the really small streams. All right, so let's talk about some of the big water. And so I actually spend most of my time Nymphing for steelhead on bigger water. So I spend a lot of my time on the Salmon River in upstate New York. And I think when you're in those situations where you're on larger water, it can be really kind of intimidating to somebody who's out there trying to Euro-nymph, because Euro-nymphing is a close quarters fishing game for the most part. I mean, if I'm using light lines, I can get a pretty good drift at distance, but I'm going to be better off a little bit closer to me. And so when you've got all that big water, I think it's intimidating to somebody who's Euro-nymphing. So here's a couple of things that I do. Number one, I'm going to look for the water that is suitable to Euro-nymphing. I'm going to look for areas where I can gain access to maybe a deeper run, or maybe I see a seam that I can reach and it looks like it's close enough and I've got area behind me to be able to do my loop casts out, to be able to get out to those areas. I just want to make sure that I can get in the right places and be able to get the right drifts, right? So look for the areas that are suitable to Euro-nymphing. On bigger water, yes, those fish can be pretty much anywhere. And so maybe the best spot is across the way, but maybe I can't get there with Euro-nymphing. So, I'm going to look at the water that I can access and I'm going to work on fishing it effectively. I'm going to break down the water in pieces and work it systematically and methodically and cover all those areas. So maybe the best spot's across where I can't reach, but maybe I've got areas that are decent in front of me, and those fish can be anywhere. Maybe I see a seam that I can fish effectively. I'm going to fish that seam. Maybe I see a rock with a slow eddy behind it. I'm going to fish that rock with a slow eddy behind it. Maybe I see a little deeper area out there. I'm going to get my flies down into those areas and get nice and slow through there. I'm going to look for those types of areas on bigger water. I do think it is helpful to be a little more versatile on bigger water. Euro-nymphing, again, close quarters fishing, it may limit you on that bigger water, and there may be other techniques that are more effective. So this is an area where I probably am going to bring a switch rod so that maybe I can throw an indicator way across the other side and be able to reach a run that I can't reach when I'm Euro-nymphing. Or maybe if there's not any people around me, maybe I can cast and I can swing. I think on bigger water, it makes sense to either target the water that is good for specifically Euro-nymphing or be versatile to be able to open yourself up to other ways of potentially catching fish. One thing I think that is absolutely crucial, especially on larger water, is being able to read that water. Being able to look at a large expanse of river and identify the area that's maybe a little slower and deeper by the way that the water looks, but also by the way that it fishes. And so, don't waste any water, work your way out to those areas, but I have found very specifically that if you find key areas, so if I'm looking at an expansive river, if I can find something that's a little bit deeper and it's a little bit slower, those are resting areas. Those are holding areas for steelhead. In the fall, they're going to be looking for areas, the first resting area after a bunch of fast water. They get through that fast water, they're going to find that slow water, and they're going to rest there for a little while. Those are fantastic areas. In the winter, if you can find deeper areas where you have slower water, where they exert less energy and they can just kind of hover and feed and recover, those are going to be fantastic places. You got to learn to identify those places by being able to see and read the water. You're looking for slower, deeper areas that may not be obvious. And I think those are the best areas that I often find because they're less pressured, less people find them, and the fish are there willing to eat. All right, so the next stream is more of a medium-sized stream, and I think like a lot of the Erie tribs fall into that category. Some of the Ontario tribs, I don't go any further out past Erie, so, but you know, I would say that this right here is about a medium-sized stream. And I think a couple of things. Number one, medium-sized streams are easier to read water. I think the fish are going to be focused in specific areas more so than on larger rivers where they can be in many different areas. And it's a little close quarters fishing. So, you know, I think the Euro nymphing really shines in those medium streams. I can go out and I can hit pretty much any area out here, hit it really effectively, and be able to cover water and find those fish. I would also say, depending on conditions, those fish might be a little spookier. They're in smaller water. They might not have those deep areas to be able to feel more protected. So you might need to be a little more stealthy when you're on these medium-sized streams. I know when I went out to Erie for the first time, the water was a little bit low. It was in March, April, and it was all about finding the right areas. And even things like, maybe not the obvious areas, but little offshoots that maybe there's a log jam or maybe there's some piece of cover that's gonna hold fish. Being able to look for fish and understand where they might be is gonna be super critical in any situation, but I think on the medium streams, it really shines on the medium streams. I do think that the medium streams can be a little more susceptible to pressure, obviously. A bigger stream can handle more fish or more people, and you can still be fishing a crowded, you know, large stream, and there's so many fish that everybody's hooking up. I've seen those a lot of days. On a medium-sized stream, you know, there's probably gonna be less fish. The fish can be more pressured more easily because they're more easily pinpointed, and there's just, they're more easily pressured in a small and medium-sized stream. So maybe look away from the main areas. If there's a nice pool on a medium stream, definitely fish it. But if there's other people there, go looking for other smaller areas that might hold a fish. All right, so the last kind of stream I'm going to target is a really small stream. And when I say small, I mean really small, smaller than most people would think. But I think fishing a really small stream, it's going to be a very different approach. It is not going to be like fishing big water. It is not even going to be like fishing medium-sized water. You have to be extremely, extremely stealthy when you are fishing small streams. I am literally going to stalk my way up that small stream, and I'm going to be looking at every possible spot. And I might not even fish for a while. I might just walk up and look for the right types of areas and scout out and see what I might see. A lot of these streams are shallow enough. If you can find a deep pool with some gravel coming out, man, sit there and watch for a little bit and see what you can see. A lot of times you'll see fish coming out into the gravel areas, or you'll see their tails moving at the edge of the deep areas. I think stalking and really sneaking up on these fish is super, super critical. Fish, steelhead that are in really small streams are gonna be really spooky. So I will literally crawl up on my hands and knees to a spot to be able to try to get access to a fish. And when I say spooky, I have unfortunately spooked way too many fish. I've walked up on holes and I'm not paying attention. The next thing I know, there's a fish right in the shallows, and I get up too close and he sees me and off he goes, and you know, I'm probably not gonna catch that fish. Or I'm walking through a whitewater section that I didn't think there was a fish holding, and I'll kick out a fish. You know, it happens all the time. And so I really learned to really stalk those small stream fish. I'm literally watching the water in every spot, looking for those areas where I think fish are gonna hold. And before I fish, watching it a little bit. If you can find a small stream that has some deep plunge pools and deep holes, but also has these gravel areas that come out of those are absolutely fantastic areas, because they're gonna provide holding places during the day. And if you're getting into the season where fish start spawning, they're gonna hang out in the deep areas during the day, and then when it gets low light conditions, they're gonna slide out onto that gravel and start doing their thing. And I think it's some of the coolest stuff to be able to watch. But you know, small streams, really, really stealthy approach. The other thing I'm gonna do on small streams, and this is something I typically do when I'm Euro nymphing anyway, but the spookier the fish are, the smaller water they're in, the more it becomes important to move your way upstream. If you are coming from upstream to downstream and you're trying to approach a hole that way and you're in small water, those fish are way more likely to see you and they're gonna spook. You're never gonna have a chance at them. I would always target a stretch and go upstream. If you need to park somewhere and then go downstream, what I would do is I would get off the beaten path. I would get kind of nowhere near that river, and I would walk the woods downstream to a point where I want to be able to get in the water and then work my way upstream. I want to fish my way upstream. I don't want a chance of those fish seeing me. As soon as they see you, it is game over. And I have been in some really, really, really small streams where it's just that way, man. If they see you, you're done. You gotta move upstream. And even a lot of times, if they're sitting in a tail of a pool and they're 30, 40 feet away, you move the wrong way, sometimes they're gonna see you and they're gone. So again, stealth is super important on those really small streams. Another thing that makes a lot of sense is looking for areas of cover, both on kind of any water, but it becomes more important on small streams and medium streams. If you can find areas where there's a log jam or there's a tree down or there's an undercut somewhere, those are incredibly likely areas to be able to find a steelhead hanging. You know, they're looking for protection, and when they're in that smaller water, they don't feel like they have a lot of protection a lot of times, and so they might bury themselves in areas where they're pretty much unreachable. I've had some pretty tough situations, and we've hooked up but not landed, but it becomes chaos when they hook up, and it's pretty awesome. But you know, you're going to look for those areas that, you know, maybe there's a down tree and there's a little undercut under that down tree, or there's a log jam, or there's a big rock, or there's something that is going to help protect those fish in really small water where they're going to be spooky. So we've talked about the different types of streams, but now let's talk about high water versus low water and what you might do in those types of situations. You know, I think if you've got low regular conditions, your to medium-sized waters are probably going to fish really well, whereas your small streams, they might be a lot tougher, right? Fishing a small stream that's low is really pretty difficult. Switching a medium stream is probably perfect. A large stream is probably perfect in low water conditions. When you have influx of water, so you know you're going to be fishing a lot of times in the spring, and your snowpack will start to melt off, and you're going to watch to see like what waters go up and what go down. The little streams are going to increase first, and then they're going to go down quickly. The medium streams are going to increase next, and they may take a little longer to go down. The big rivers are going to take a little bit longer to get high, but they're going to stay high longer, and it's going to take longer for them to come down. So, you know, understand where you are in that cycle. Sometimes in March, we hit a little bit of the early thaw. The big rivers might not jump up as quickly, but once those big rivers jump up quickly, it might be time to figure out another situation and go find those smaller rivers. So if you find yourself in high water conditions and whatever water you're on, that water in the main stem may be a little too fast, right? A lot of times what you'll see is those steelhead will move right close to the bank where it's nice and slow. So if you've got really high water conditions, try finding those fish really close to the bank. I've walked upstream to downstream, and I've spooked plenty of fish right along the edge of the water, whereas if I had been approaching it appropriately and going upstream, I would have been able to potentially see those fish, but I would have been fishing that seam on my way up and potentially had a chance at those fish. So high water conditions, look for those slowest areas. A lot of times that's going to be right tucked next to the bank. If you run into blowout conditions, you know, those small streams are going to go up, but they're going to come down. And when they go up, sometimes fish move in, and when they come down, they can be perfect fishing. So you got blowout conditions on the bigger water, go looking for those smaller streams. I think they could be really, they've definitely saved my day and my trip on multiple occasions when my main water became unfishable or really difficult to fish, and those small streams have absolutely been sometimes phenomenal. So I think you got to learn to be able to adapt. That's the name of the game when you're steelhead fishing. So, you know, I think having a base of knowledge of the different types of conditions and what you want to do in those different types of conditions is really important. I'm hoping that this series can give you guys a basis for some of that, so it can shorten your learning curve a little bit. All right, so we've talked about different types of streams, we've talked about different types of conditions. Let's now talk about how we're going to target steelhead in different seasons, different times of year, different water temperatures, right? So I've mentioned before in the volume 1 that, you know, in my areas anyway, my first runs of steelhead start coming in September, but most likely October, late October, and early November are the really, really good runs. Boy, when you catch steelhead in the fall, when they're fresh to the river or they haven't been in the river that long, they're definitely my favorite fish to catch. They are energetic, they're aggressive. Almost every fish you hook is jumping 3 or 4 times in the water. It's really pretty phenomenal. It's my favorite time of year to be able to catch these fish just because, God, they're so crazy. I absolutely love catching steelhead in the fall. In the fall, those fish are migrating. They're moving. It's a time of when you see a lot of fish movement. Okay, so that's going to mean a couple of things. It's going to mean they can be anywhere. They're going to be coming up all these different places. They'll be moving in and out. And so, you know, I would not spare any water at that point. I would fish anything that looks like it might be someplace that's going to be able to potentially hold fish. One thing I've learned in salmon and steelhead fishing is that you will definitely find groups of fish in the best places. And so when fish are moving, if you can find a stretch of like shallower, faster water that they have to move up through where there's not a lot of holding water, when they get to that first piece of holding water, that's going to be a resting area and a feeding area. And those are phenomenal places. When we were out on the Salmon River back in November, we were having a really tough day. And we said, and the water had bumped up a little bit, and we said, you know what, let's go down a little bit further in the river and see if we can find areas where maybe some fresh fish are moving up into. And we had a big wide section that was fast, shallow moving water, and then we hit that first little area of holding water, and there was, I don't know, maybe 8 or so steelhead stacked in there. We couldn't see them, but we hooked a bunch of them, we landed a bunch. Another guy saw us fishing, he came over and he started catching some too. If you can find that first holding area above those flat, you know, kind of pocket watery sections where there's not a lot of place for those fish to hold, they absolutely love to sit in the tails of those pools and just hang out the first place they can rest. That goes for both salmon and steelhead. When those fish are on the move, they're looking for those spots. Those are your resting spots, and they can be phenomenal. Another really cool area to find fish in the fall is these steelhead are chasing other fish that are coming up into the river to spawn, whether that's, you know, your Pacific salmon species or maybe brown trout. And a lot of times on a big pool, if you're fishing in a river that also holds salmon, you'll see salmon stacked up at the tails of pools doing their spawning activities. And if you don't want to target those salmon and you're there for steelhead, the steelhead will often be hanging out directly behind those fish, you know, probably anywhere from a few feet to 10 yards down the river, picking off the eggs that those salmon are dropping. It's like a little vending machine of eggs for those fish. So look for those areas where salmon are spawning or other fish are spawning and go directly behind those. And a lot of times you'll find steelhead just picking off eggs. One thing about the fall, I'll say, is if you're on a highly pressured river, first light can be fantastic. Those fish have moved. They've moved into new areas overnight. You get in and you see a lot of activity oftentimes right off the bat in the morning in the fall. You know, especially on highly pressured fish, they've been getting pressured all day long. By the end of the day, man, they're not going to bite a lot of times. You hit them fresh the next day. They've had, you know, 12, 14 hours of not being harassed by fishermen. And then they see the first thing that comes by. And a lot of times they see that in the fall. They will be active kind of right off the bat, especially on pressured waters. So in the fall, I think you can find them in pocket water. I think you can find them in, you know, any kind of like little spots like even what's behind me, or you can find them in the big deep holes. You'll find them pretty much anywhere in the fall. And let me tell you what, you hook one in the fall, hold on, get ready, because they're gonna go crazy. All right, when the water temperature starts to drop, you're getting down into the 30-degree range, you know, with the 30s. Anytime you get into the high 30s, mid 30s, those fish are gonna become a little more lethargic. You probably won't have as much fish movement. But I'll tell you, listen, steelhead, Nothing is a formula, okay? You have some guidelines that you follow. General rules in winter are, yeah, you're gonna focus on those slower, deeper areas where fish are gonna have to exert less energy and they're gonna be able to get food that's very easily delivered to them. They're less likely to be in fast water. They're more likely to be in those slow, deep, wintering type holes. And they could very well be stacked up in those places. You're more likely to find them in those places, but it doesn't mean that's the only place they'll be. You know, steelhead can move into the river systems and do move into the river systems and move upstream and migrate even during the coldest months of the year. And so one instance, I was up there in February, I was trying to fish all the slower, deeper stuff that I could find. And there was a guy down below me in a riffly, like kind of like a wide, shallow area, and he was swinging flies, and I thought, that guy is never gonna hook up. Well, I'm the one that got skunked, and he's the one that hooked up. So you never 100% know where those fish are gonna be. I guess what I would say is in the winter, start at those main types of areas where, you know, it's gonna be easier for them to hold deeper, slower areas. But if you're not getting activity, don't ignore other areas. I mean, I've been up there in, you know, in a pretty shallow area, but I've got a rock with a little eddy behind it, and I've caught, you know, winter steelhead in those types of situations as well. In the winter, you may have very shortened times of activity. So I've been up on the river in the middle of February, and you know, you're there at sunup, you're trying to get a good spot, you're trying to find areas to fish, and nobody is hooking up at all the entire morning. The day gets to just, you know, to a certain point, and there may be an hour or 2 hours of activity, and all of a sudden you start seeing people hook up in different places. It can literally be absolutely dead, and then a very short window of activity, and then going back to be completely dead. So if you're trying to think about, should I move or should I go somewhere? If you feel like you're on a good spot, if you feel like there's fish in there, maybe they just need to turn on when the day gets to be the right temperature or whatever. You know, it's a consideration, at least I would say, is sometimes in the winter you have very short periods of activity. When you do hook a fish in the winter, you're probably not going to get the same type of fight that you would in the fall. In the fall, those fish are crazy. They're acrobatic. They're jumping all over the place. In the winter, when the water temperatures get to be into the 30s, mid 30s, those fish are going to be more lethargic. They're probably not going to jump. I have seen fish jump in the winter, but it's way less often, and they're probably not going to make as many runs as they would during the fall. So, you know, the fight might not be as incredible as it was in the fall, but just understand the fish would potentially, most likely, be a little more lethargic in the winter. All right, when we get to the spring, we'll start seeing spawning activity for fish. You know, maybe in the middle of March, you start hearing reports of fish digging in the gravel around, you know, middle of March, toward the end of March. By the time you get into April, you're starting to get warmer temperatures coming in, and you're starting to see a lot more spawning activity. I think most of the spawning activity probably happens in early to mid-April. The main thing to understand is the behavior that steelhead are going to exhibit when they're getting into those spawning activities. So they are typically going to spawn. They're going to go out into these gravel areas, these shallower gravel areas. They're going to start digging around in the gravel. They're typically going to do that in low light conditions. So they're going to do it early in the morning, or they're going to do it later in the evening, or even into the night. Or, you know, if you have really overcast conditions, you're more likely to see them out. The brighter it is, the less likely it's going to be that you're going to see them out on the gravel beds spawning. And so most of the time that we're fishing is not spawning activity time. It's usually their resting time and their feeding time. And so what you're going to look for is you're going to look for the deeper areas that are close to areas where they would spawn, the gravel beds where they would spawn. A lot of times that's the tailouts of pools, where the pool comes and starts to shallow out. That's where they're typically going to spawn, or they might be going up into the creeks and stuff like that. But during the day, focus on those deeper areas that are near those gravel spawning areas. As you get into those low light conditions, you'll start to see fish coming out of those deeper areas and into those spawning areas. And so, you know, there's a whole thing about fishing fish when they're spawning. Learn to identify the female. The female is typically a little fatter, a little more silver, and there may be multiple males along with a female. For the most part, I would say leave spawning fish alone. If you can identify the female, stay away from the female and maybe target some of the males in that area. I have done that and been successful and not disturbed the fish that were spawning. Another thing to watch is as fish are spawning, there may be, again, other fish behind those steelhead that are spawning, and they may be feeding and picking up those eggs as those fish are spawning. So that is another good time. We mentioned it in the fall during the salmon, or the salmon or the browns when they're spawning, but it's also when the steelhead are spawning. And I've caught steelhead behind other steelhead while those steelhead were spawning and just picking up those eggs. So here, a little story to kind of highlight how those fish move throughout the day during the spawn. My buddy and I found a spot that was kind of hidden. It was one of those areas where you had to learn to read water well to be able to find them. And one of our guys found the fish, and it was in the spring. It was in April, and the reason this was good was because it was a holding area during the day for all the fish that were spawning early and late. So we found some fish, and we found out that it was really good fishing. And then as it got later in the day, you know, we thought we wore the spot out, honestly. But what turned out is those fish started going out into the gravel areas. Then we couldn't see them, but they were going out into other gravel areas and they were spawning. They were engaging in early spawning activities probably. The next morning, I went and got there really early to grab that spot. My buddy and I fished for hours and didn't get a single bite. And then, you know, we got to mid-morning and all of a sudden we started catching fish, and it was ridiculous fishing throughout the entire day until the evening came again. And what we discovered was we were the holding area for those fish during the day where they would rest and eat, and then they would go out into all the different areas and spawn in the low light conditions. So that spot was not good in the morning and in the evening, but during the day when they were resting and feeding, it was phenomenal. So, you know, understand what activities those fish are engaging in and try to target them appropriately. You know, if they're in those resting areas during the day, find those resting areas. If you can find one, my God, that thing filled in all day long. As we hooked and caught fish, it just filled in with more and more fish. It was ridiculous. But look for those holding areas during the day that's close to gravel, close to areas where fish are going to spawn. So the last topic I'm going to cover in this video is, should I stay or should I go? And I always hear the song when I say that, but there's a decision that you need to make at some point in your day of, am I going to keep fishing the same stuff that I'm fishing, or am I going to go and explore, right? And I think it depends on a ton of things. And so you'll need to determine, are you going to stay or are you going to go? And that can make or break a day. The first question I have for you in that situation is, are you somebody who likes to stay on the same piece of water and just grind it out? Or are you somebody who likes to explore? For me, I don't like to sit. I don't like to watch the same drift over and over again. I like to go out and I like to find water and I like to explore. I find that that's when I learn. I find that that's when I discover more. And so I'm more likely to go explore than I am to go sit on a spot. We have a group of friends that go, and there's a couple of guys, they'll sit on a spot all day and they'll just grind it out. And another guy and I, we're like, dude, we can't do that. We gotta go explore. We gotta go do something different. And we'll go off, and you know what? Both of us end up being successful, but it's really about what we wanna do. So number one, what kind of person are you? Are you the sit and grind it out, or are you a mover? You gotta go and move, and that's 100% me. I like to explore. There are situations in which I will sit on a spot, and that is when maybe it's a little more crowded and it's harder to get a spot, and I feel like I've got a good spot. Maybe it's I've got a good spot, maybe there's not a lot of people around, but I've got a good spot, and my spot is an area that keeps filling fish in. So fish keep filling into that spot because they're moving. And so again, those areas that are, you know, the first resting area after a whitewater or a shallow section, it's the first area that those fish can rest in. Those are areas that are going to keep filling with fish. Or, you know, kind of mentioned during the spawn, if I found a good resting area, I might be just waiting for those fish to be done with their spawning activities and fill into those resting areas. I'm probably gonna sit on that spot. You know, another consideration, I mentioned it a little bit before, but like, is there room for me to move, right? Is the river crowded? And if I have a really good spot and it's crowded and I had to get there at 5 a.m. to get that spot, and I have a chance of losing that spot if I try and go and explore, I might sit on that spot because it's the only place, it's the best place available to me. There have been a lot of situations where I'll have a decent spot in a pool, but it's tough fishing, and there's a lot of people fishing that spot. And that's sometimes a situation where I look at it and I'll be like, you know, I really just can't keep doing this anymore. And I'll go and I'll start looking for fish in other water. And again, that's when I grow, that's when I learn. And I'm an explorer, so I love to do that stuff. Another consideration is, you know, maybe especially in the winter, do I have a good spot that I'm just waiting for those fish to turn on? You know, in the winter especially, there may only be an hour or two of activity. If I'm in the prime spot and I just need those fish to turn on, I'm probably gonna stay in that spot, hold my water, and try to be fishing as much as possible when the spot turns on. Another situation is, you know, am I in tough water conditions and not, you know, do I wanna move from pool 1 to pool 2 or riffle 1 to riffle 2, but do I need to change my complete game that day? I'm on a big stream, I'm struggling, I'm not finding success, and that's where I was last spring. I was struggling, I was not finding success, and I said halfway through the day, I'd put in a couple miles and I'm like, I gotta do something different, and it's not this river. And so I left that river, I went and found a small stream, and you know, I found a much better situation on that small stream. I found some pretty phenomenal fish, and the most memorable fight I'll ever have in my life, and probably one of the other most memorable fights where I had to dive under a log and do all sorts of crazy stuff with a steelhead. But you know, maybe you need to change rivers. Maybe you need to go find something else. Maybe there's not activity in the river at all and you need to completely change your location on the river by miles. You know, don't be afraid to make those calls. Maybe if you grind it out, you'll find a fish, but maybe if you call an audible and you do something completely different, you'll find yourself in a better situation. So I think answering that question of should I stay or should I go, you know, that's gonna be very dependent on the different types of situations. And you know what, you may make the wrong decision, but either way, you gotta make a decision. And I'm the kind of guy where if I'm not seeing the activity, or if I don't have specific reasons to stay, I'm gonna go explore. And that's just the way I play. It's the way I love to steelhead fish. It's the way I love to Euro nymph. But I think you gotta find what's right for you in the different situations that you find yourself. All right, so that is a wrap for volume 3. There's a lot of information about how to attack fish in a lot of different situations. I hope that it was helpful. This would be a good video to be able to break down and digest a little bit more. Probably go back and watch it again. And then when you find yourself in those types of situations on the water, hopefully you'll have a little more ammunition to figure out what you should do. Ultimately, I want you guys to be successful, and you get that through experience, whether it's your own experiences or things you hear from people. And so hopefully you're finding this series helpful. I really appreciate you guys being here. Thank you all so much for being here, and we will see you for volume 4 soon.